Hi, and welcome to Writing Effective Voice Content. My name is Myre, and I thank you for joining this 30-minute presentation. So who should attend? Well, content developers and technical writers who are new to voice. You may have experience writing online help topics or UI text, error messages, even chatbot scripts. Content strategists who want to understand some of the key differences when designing content for voice. And even voice interaction developers who are developing content on their own. A little bit about me. I've been in the content development industry for over 30 years. I'm currently the senior director for a team called ContentWorks at ADP based in Roseland, New Jersey. I manage a team of 36 content developers across 20 products, and I'm responsible for overseeing the content strategy, architecture, and the tone across all delivery channels, including voice. I also do some voice coding on the side. I'm an adjunct professor at the New Jersey Institute of Technology in Newark, New Jersey, and I teach graduate level courses in content strategy, information architecture, and M-learning design. Additionally, I have a master's in professional and technical communication and a bachelor's in computer science, both from NJIT. And I'm also a certified usability analyst from Human Factors International. Here's what we're going to cover today. I'm going to start with a brief terminology review. I'll talk about the things you need to think about before you start writing content. We'll then go into effective asking and effective answering, and then I'll sum it all up at the end. So brief terminology review. These are the 4 terms I'm going to use throughout this presentation: skills, intents, utterances, and slots. Skills are essentially voice apps. They're what the user invokes when they wake up the voice AI. Intents are tasks that can be accomplished within a skill. Utterances are the words that the user says to launch a skill or provide information to an intent. And slots are variables within an utterance that are used to complete the intent. So let's take a look at an example. Ask my calendar to set a reminder for next Saturday at 9 a.m. The entire sentence is the utterance. This is what the user says to initiate the skill and to complete the intent. The skill is the calendar. The intent or the task within that skill is set a reminder. And next Saturday at 9 a.m. are 2 slots or variables that are used to complete the intent. So before you write, these are the things we're going to cover. It's knowing your users. Remember that you're writing for synchronous communication and making sure you get your utterances correct. So knowing your users, you have to understand how your users speak. Don't assume that users speak the way you do, because they don't. And you need to do some research and you need to do some analysis. So you can review your search data, and this can be search data that comes from looking through your help topics or even looking through your application. So looking for the ways that people search for things in your app or your help. You can conduct a UX study to learn how your users refer to things. So you want to understand what terms they're using and how they're phrasing things. If you already have voice skills that are live and you have access to those logs, that's a tremendous source of information, because you can actually see how your users are already interacting with your voice AI. And that can give you a sense of how they want to interact with your AI. Because that's something you need to understand, is how your users expect to interact with a voice AI. And you can do that by creating a tone study. We did that here at ADP. We actually created a tone study, and we used that to create our AI's voice, because you want to make sure that you're essentially in this sweet spot in the middle of what's acceptable. You don't want to be too far over to this side where you're too robotic or you're too formal. You also don't want to be to the other extreme where you're glib or condescending, silly, even offensive. And you can use this information to build personas of your users. Now, as I said, I work for ADP. You probably think of us as the payroll company, and payroll is a big part of our business. We run a lot of payrolls. There's a lot more that we do across the whole human capital management experience, but for purpose of this demonstration, we're going to stick with payroll. So, for example, here's a response that could come out of one of our AI skills, and this is: there is an error processing your payroll. Would you like me to help you fix it? Now, this is within our sweet spot, within our margins of what our users deem acceptable, as opposed to something, this is obviously a way out there example that we would never do, but oh, I totally whacked your payroll. You mad, bro? This is not something that would fly. We're talking about payrolls. We're talking about people's money. We're talking about people's lives, people's livelihoods. We would never be so glib as to say this. Perhaps there's a scenario where for a particular voice skill and a particular set of users, that would be appropriate. But we know that for our users, that would not be, and we would never do something like that. But just as a hyperbolic example, it backs up the point that you need to know who your users are, how they speak, how they want to be spoken to, and roll that all together in creating your AI's voice. Keep in mind that voice is synchronous communication, and it's a unique medium in that it is truly synchronous. Other types of media, other channels that you write for, help, UI text, system messages, guides, quick reference cards, even chatbot scripts are asynchronous. Voice interactions happen in the here and now, and there's nothing for the user to fall back on except their memory, unless they happen to be taking notes as they're interacting with your voice AI. If you think about voice response units, telephone voice response units, IVRs, one of the things that people hate about them is that it's essentially a list or a menu of choices, and you have to listen synchronously through that list to all of the choices to figure out which one you have to press. And the problem is you may be listening and number 2 might be right. I don't know, let me listen 3, 4, 5, 6. No, none of those are right. Maybe it was 2, but I don't even remember what 2 was anymore because I spent all this time listening to the other 4 choices. So you're putting a cognitive load on the user. And that's the problem with any kind of synchronous communication, is avoiding that cognitive load. And we'll talk a lot about that in this presentation. So wait a second, I said chat is asynchronous? Well, actually, to a large degree, yes. And this is something that caught me off guard when I first started getting involved in voice, because when I teach at NJIT, one of the ways that I interact with my students is through chat. And I always thought of that as synchronous communication, because I would type something, my student would respond. I would type something back, my student would respond again. That's a form of synchronous communication, or so I thought. But the thing to think about with chat is that your users can go back in time, essentially, and review the transcript. So they could go 2 minutes earlier in the conversation, read what they had said or read what the chatbot said, and then go back down to present time and continue the conversation. You could technically build that capability into voice, but would you? Imagine, would you like me to repeat our entire conversation or just the last 5 minutes? Do you want to give me a timestamp and I'll repeat what I said then? You really can't do that with voice, not in any kind of usable way. The other thing is that voice AIs interpret pauses in the user's speech as the end of an utterance. And then they begin parsing that utterance to look for things like intents and slots so that they can complete the skill. Chats, on the other hand, will wait for you to reply. So you could reply to something that the chatbot says, and you can get up and go get a cup of coffee and come back 5 minutes later and see what the chatbot wrote back. You could then respond or walk away and do something else. So unless the chatbot has a built-in timer to time out the conversation and end it, the chatbot will wait there forever for you to respond and continue your conversation. So that's how chat is really an asynchronous form of communication as opposed to voice, which is truly synchronous. Getting your utterances right. As I said before, with the before you write section, you need to know how your users refer to things like your company's products, your product features, and the different terms that you use. You need to know how they phrase their requests. And again, you learn this by looking at your search data, by conducting UX studies, by looking at your existing voice skill logs if you have them. You need to then write multiple utterances that account for as many of these terms and phrasings as you can. It's a lot of work up front to get it right, and it can be tedious work, but it's so important because you could have the best voice content ever written across any skill in the world. And if your users don't use the correct utterances to get to it, they will never hear it. This is an iterative process. You have to do a lot of work up front, and then you have to test and revise and repeat. You may have to add utterances in the future. You may find that there are certain utterances you don't need that you can remove. But it's so important to get the utterances right because it's the gateway into the rest of your content. And let's look at a quick example. Say you were trying to set up direct deposit, and I'm going to use direct deposit again as a throughout this this presentation. So say you wanted to set up direct deposit and have a voice skill to do that. You may ask your users, how would you start that conversation if you wanted to have a voice AI set up direct deposit for you? And they might say, well, I want to, or help me. So you have some initiating phrases. Then you have, what is the verb? What is the actual intent? How would you say that? Set up? Oh, I'd say set up. Oh, I'd say add or configure. So now we have a couple of different intents here, set up, add, and configure, different synonyms for that. And then direct deposit. What are some synonyms of direct deposit? Oh, well, I don't think of it as direct deposit. I call it direct transfer, or I think of it as electronic deposit. Okay, so now we have 3 different ways of referring to direct deposit. All of these together can create the utterances that you need, sample utterances you need to kick off the direct deposit skill or intent. And this actually equates to 18 different sample utterances, all of which will help the user set up direct deposit. And you have to include all of these sample utterances to make sure that if any one of these are spoken, that starts the skill to create direct deposit. Effective asking. The things we're going to talk about here are what I call the obvious stuff. Also recognizing when a slot has been filled, making sure the ask is last, and providing content at the moment of need. Now, some of the obvious stuff, be brief but accurate. Can't be more obvious than that. Studies have shown what we all suspect, that voice should be brief. People don't want the voice AI to go on, either with the question or the answer. Avoid technical and industry jargon, unless, of course, you find out that your users use that industry jargon or that technical terminology. Avoid parentheticals. Again, you would never want to hear a parenthetical in a voice response, but if you're taking content from another source and repurposing it for voice, first of all, it's incredibly dangerous and it requires a lot of heavy editing, but you have to make sure you remove things that aren't going to work in voice, like parentheticals. Only ask for enough information to complete the intent. If you're like me and you've been working with minimalist writing principles for years, you know that you only provide the necessary information at the time it's needed. However, if you have a persona and it's kind of unclear whether or not this particular piece of content is applicable to that persona, if you're writing a help topic, you may decide, okay, well, you know, for the sake of the user, I'm going to put this in. It's only a couple of sentences, and I'll let this go. In a help topic, that's not as big a deal, because if the user gets to that point and they see this content there and they're like, I don't need it, they just skim over it and move on. With voice, that's an extra couple of words or a sentence, God forbid a paragraph, of content that's being spoken to them that they don't need. Don't pretend to be human. One of the beautiful things about voice AIs is that no one expects them to be human. And as an anecdote, when Apple first released Siri, they set the expectations for Siri very high. They really built it up. And unfortunately, Siri didn't live up to those expectations because it couldn't. They basically touted it as almost human, and it really wasn't. Conversely, when Amazon came out with Alexa, they set the expectations very low. Alexa could do some things. It was going to learn over time. It was going to improve. And as a result, the expectations were low. So Alexa exceeded the expectations and now has, I think, somewhere around 70% of the commercial AI market. Watch your tone. As you're writing, keep your tone steady in the back of your mind so that everything you're writing falls within that acceptable set of parameters. So it's not too formal or robotic, not too glib or condescending. And again, this is going to be iterative. You're going to want to test this with users. You're going to want to revise it as necessary, and you're going to want to repeat and continue that process. Recognizing when a slot has been filled. If your user has already provided a slot as part of an earlier utterance, don't ask for it again. If you're working with Alexa, the developer toolkit can actually delegate slot collection to Alexa so that you don't have to worry about it. Alexa will keep track and only ask for those slots that haven't been filled yet. If you're working with a homegrown AI, make sure it's smart enough to do this too. And the quote from Shane Mack, the CEO of Assist here, really kind of spells out why it's more than just trying to avoid annoying your users. It's actually a benefit of using voice AI over other media like the web. If you have a 5-step flow to book a hotel and you say, hey, I need hotels on Saturday for 3 nights, that's now 2 steps less than what the web would require because the language has made it shorter. You provided 2 slots in your initial utterance, Saturday and 3 nights. So now you only have 3 other slots to collect, as opposed to the web where you would have to provide all 5 of those. And here's an example. Let's take a look at this. This would be an online help topic for setting up direct deposit. Obviously, one of the other beautiful things about voice AI is you can ignore steps 1, 2, and 7. Now here, steps 3 through 6, we have 4 slots. We have the routing and transit number, the account type, the account number, and the amount. If you're a user and you've gotten to this screen, the actual direct deposit screen, and you're completing the task, and you already put in the account type, the account number, and the amount, and you're not sure what that ABA-RTN is, you can click on the help topic, and this help topic will appear. Obviously, the help topic is not smart enough to know you've already provided steps 4, 5, and 6, so it's going to show you them. Well, in an online help world, that's not a big deal because the user is going to look and scan this and say, okay, step 3, this is the 9-digit number. Okay, good. Well, again, they'll just scan it, find the information they need, and move on. In voice, we have the ability to delegate. So here's a voice example. Ask payroll to add direct deposit. My checking account number is 987 blah, blah, blah. So now we've already provided 2 pieces of information, the account type, which is the checking account, and the account number, which is 987, and so on. So there are only 2 slots missing, the routing and transit number and the amount. So what should happen? Your AI should be smart enough to only ask for those 2 and recognize that it has the 2 that the user provided in the original utterance. The ask is last. The last thing the user hears should be their call to action. If there's any clarifying information, you need to put that first. And this is a big shift from how people are used to writing, content developers like myself, because you always have that idea of the big idea first. So if you're talking about a task, you have to talk about the thing that needs to be done. And if there's any clarifying information, you can put that as a note below the task or have it within the wording of the task. But the action always comes first in things like online help. In voice, it's different. And you can see Tim McElrath's quote, if you're reading something off a screen, you want to put the major point at the beginning. The big takeaway should come first because people will read the first sentence and then they'll skim the rest. Whatever you want people to do with voice, that has to be put right at the end. And the reason why is because you want contiguity between the ask or the call to action and the person's response. If you put clarifying information in the middle, you're now separating the call to action from the person's response. And if you think back to that voice response example that I was talking about earlier, well, you're talking about number 2, maybe it's number 6. The further away you go from the call to action and the person's opportunity to respond to that call to action, the more cognitive load you put on the user. So let's look at an example. If we have a situation where we want to know what account to use, the proper way to do it with voice is to say you can deposit funds into your checking, savings, or money market account. This is the clarifying information. And then here's the call to action. Which account do you want to use? As opposed to how we would probably typically write it in online help, which account do you want to deposit funds to? You can say checking, savings, or money market. That's not how you want to do it. You want the clarifying information first. Providing content at the moment of need. Most content writers are used to providing just-in-time information. When writing for voice, this concept is crucial because in other channels, having content in the wrong place, like a paragraph where it really doesn't belong, would be an annoyance, probably something users would look at, kind of be a little puzzled, but they would just skim through it or ignore it entirely. In voice, it can be a skill killer. So let's look at a really hyperbolic example. This is a very long paragraph that theoretically would be spoken by a voice AI. I need your bank's American Banking Association routing and transit number, commonly referred to as a routing transit number. The routing and transit number is a 9-digit number. All these different places you can find it on your bank's app, their website, calling your local branch, or it's the first Myre number printed on the bottom left corner of your checks. What is your bank's routing and transit number? Well, there's so much wrong with this, right? While the content is 100% accurate, and that's not disputed, it's anything but brief. It also describes multiple ways of finding the information. Only one of them clearly tells you where to find it. Jargon alert, there's clearing of funds. We're talking about Myre numbers. Yikes, a parenthetical, again, never do that. The good thing though is the ask is last. So they got one thing right. But here's the dilemma in all of this. The routing and transit number is a required slot, so the user does need to provide it. The problem is the user may have no idea what that number is or where to find it, and will almost definitely not have that number in hand at the point and will have to abandon the skill, hopefully to come back, but maybe not. So the question is, what is the true moment of need? When does the user truly need to know this information and be able to get it? The answer is much earlier in the process than when it's originally being asked for. So here's an example. I want to set up direct deposit. This is the user, this is a sample utterance, and this is the initiation of the intent. So right at the very top, when the user is invoking that intent to start processing the skill, the AI responds, okay, I'll need the following information: your account number, the type of account, the amount you want to deposit, your bank's routing and transit number. If you need help finding any of this information, tell me what you need help with, otherwise say I'm ready. So if the user has that routing and transit number and all the other information, they can just say, I'm ready, and the skill continues. If not, they can ask for help on any of the information asked for by the skill. And for example, how do I find the routing and transit number? And then the AI responds, telling them one place where the routing and transit number can be found, and it's the universal place. It's the lower left-hand corner on the front of lower left-hand corner of your check, right in front of the account number. All of those other ways, your bank's application, the web, calling your branch, none of that really tells you exactly how to get that number, because we can't tell you where on your bank's app it's going to be, where on the website it's going to be, or what number to call to get it from your local branch. The routing and transit number on the check is universal, so that's where you put it. So here, we've realized where the true moment of need is, and the true moment of need is at the very beginning, because if the user gets to the point and says, how do I find the routing and transit number here? They can say, oh, I don't have it, I have to go back and get it. They can abandon the skill here very early in the process, as opposed to getting all the way through to the point where they're being asked for the routing and transit number and they have no idea where it is. So again, the true moment of need is, in this particular case, is up front, right at the top, as opposed to when you're actually being asked for it. Effective answering. Well, there's the same obvious stuff as for asking, right? We want to be brief but accurate, avoid jargon, terminology, all of that stuff that we talked about already. Just answering the question. Avoid long answers. Allow for visuals but don't rely on them. And consider other channels for overly complex answers. So just answer the question. We all use chunking. Everybody who's a content developer, technical writer, you understand that we need to chunk content either into topics. Sometimes if we're reusing content with data or something, we're using sections or elements that we can share in various topics. But you need to coordinate your answer with the intent, and your answer needs to match the intent exactly. So we're talking about chunking at essentially the micro level, where you're specifically responding to the answer that was asked. And let's look at a real world example of this. If you ask Alexa what is the temperature, Alexa will tell you what the temperature is. If you ask, is it going to rain, Alexa will tell you whether or not it's going to rain. It might rain, what the percent chance is, when it might happen. If you ask, what's the weather today, then Alexa is going to give you a forecast. And that's perfect, because the intent is directly related, so that when you ask the question, you're getting the answer specifically to that question. No more, no less. We have, my wife and I have a very sophisticated home personal weather station here. And it's really cool. It interacts with Weather Underground, and you can go search on Weather Underground and find our little weather station and see what our weather is basically in our backyard. It's a really sophisticated product, and it's actually very cool. They have an Alexa skill for this that is nowhere near as cool as the product. And here's why. If you ask this product or ask this skill what the temperature is, it tells you the outdoor temperature is 72.3 degrees. It feels like 72. The humidity is 27%. The dew point is this. The wind speed is this. It's coming out of this direction with gusts up to this. There hasn't been any rain today, or there was. The relative pressure is 29.62 inches, falling at some rate. The UV index is 7. Solar radiation is this. If you ask, is it going to rain today? It responds, the outdoor temperature is 72.3 degrees. It feels like 72.1. The humidity, and then if you ask for the full weather report, it gives you that. So no matter what you ask, it's always giving you this full weather report. So this is not chunked at all. Your intent, the answer to the intent is completely irrelevant, because no matter what you ask, it's going to give you this full weather report. So obviously not the way to do that. It's incredibly frustrating and frankly really lame. It's a really, really bad skill design. So the Alexa skill obviously is much better, because the question and the answer are completely in parallel, and that's how it should be. Avoid long answers, no surprise, right? Again, studies show that long answers and long questions are bad. Long answers are almost as bad as long questions. Apply standard minimalist writing principles when you're using your answers. Again, make sure that you're answering succinctly and accurately, as briefly as possible. Use progressive disclosure when applicable, and overlay all of this with your overall tone strategy. So again, keep in mind as you're writing your answers, just like you were when you were writing the questions, that your tone study is sitting there in the back of your mind. So when you're writing your content, you're within those parameters, those acceptable parameters. Progressive disclosure with voice. You have to answer the question as succinctly as possible. If the answer is complex, offer the user the opportunity to learn more. And you'll hear Alexa do this frequently when it says, would you like to hear more? And then if you say yes, it provides additional information, whether clarifying or augmented information, but that's progressive disclosure. It starts off small and adds on as needed. Use progressive disclosure sparingly though, because it'll be very annoying if you have progressive disclosure on everything and Alexa keeps asking, or your AI keeps asking, would you like to hear more? Would you like to hear more? Would you like to hear more? Allow for visuals, but don't rely on them. A lot of things, like Alexa has an app, and you'll frequently hear, please say your Alexa app for more information. But the voice content needs to stand alone. It needs to be self-contained and completely answer the question. You can't assume that someone's going to have access to an app. Even with Alexa, the app might be on their phone, which is in another room, or they might just not want to use it. You have to make sure that the information that you provide in a visual augments what is said, but doesn't replace it. And again, with direct deposit, when I created my prototype, I did refer people to the Alexa app where they could see an image of a check showing where the routing and transit number is and showing where the account number is. But in my voice content, I specifically explained where those numbers were. So the visual is a nice help, but it's not required. And that's how visuals have to be treated when you're talking about voice. Consider other channels for overly complex answers. Progressive disclosure and static images may be perfect for some complex answers, but they might not always be enough. And in those cases, you might consider channel switching to provide more information. And an example would be to send content via email. I was creating a skill for release notes for one of our products. And in the skill, I was talking about highlights because, again, you're not going to read the entire release notes. That would be insane. So I would have the top 5 highlights across the entire release. I would allow them to drill down into particular sections, and we talk about the highlights there. But again, it was a few words or a sentence about each thing, not the full set of release notes. So I offer the users the opportunity. Would you like me to email the full release notes to you? If the user says yes, then their email on file gets sent the release notes as an attachment, as a PDF, so that the user can go and look at the full release notes. They can get the highlights from the voice app, and then through another channel, in this case email and a PDF, they were able to get the full release notes. And finally, it's not a crime to admit that some scenarios are not appropriate for voice. And I say yet, it might mean ever. And you have to really keep that in mind. Don't try to force a complex idea into voice because you think you should. In some cases, it's just not going to work. And honestly, it's going to give voice a bad name. So to summarize, invest the time to learn how your users speak and how they want to be spoken to. Use the data you have, strive to get more. Use search data, voice logs, conduct UX studies, conduct tone studies. Make sure you have that information before you start. Remember, it's an iterative process. Test, revise, repeat. Ask for only the slots you need. Recognize what the true moment of need is. Answer as succinctly as possible. Use progressive disclosure or other channels when necessary. And finally, recognize when a skill or an intent is not appropriate for voice. It's summer. I hope you're enjoying it. Here's a summer reading list. These are just a few of the things that I referenced when I put this presentation together. Obviously, there's plenty more, but if you want to get started learning more about how to write for voice, these are some good resources for you. And of course, I'd be happy to continue the conversation. If you want to talk more about writing effective content for voice, here's my contact information. Thank you and have a great day.